In 1826, a woman walked away from slavery. Not ran, walked. In the pre-dawn darkness of a November morning, she took her infant daughter and left everything else behind. 3 other children, a life she knew, the only world she'd ever inhabited. Years later, she would explain her reasoning with characteristic precision. Running away was wicked, she believed. But walking away by daylight, that was just fine. That woman was Isabella Baumfree. The world would come to know her by another name entirely. The story of Sojourner Truth is the story of a woman who transformed herself 3 times over. Born into the cruelty of northern slavery, she became Isabella van Wagenen, a free woman who won the first civil rights case of its kind. Then she became Sojourner Truth, an itinerant preacher with a voice that could fill halls and move hearts. But more than any single transformation, her story reveals something essential about what it meant to fight for freedom in 19th century America. Not freedom as an abstract concept, but freedom as a daily practice, a thing you had to claim and defend and extend to others, again and again, until your dying breath. Isabella Baumfree was born around 1797 in Swartekil, in Ulster County, New York, about 95 miles north of New York City. Her parents were James and Elizabeth Baumfree. James had been captured from what is now Ghana. Elizabeth, known as Mau Mau Bet, was the daughter of people taken from Guinea. They belonged to Colonel Johannes Hardenberg, a wealthy Dutch landowner whose family had built their fortune on a 2-million-acre land patent in the Catskill Mountains, acquired from the Esopus people in 1708. This is important because it explains something that often surprises people about Sojourner Truth. Her first language wasn't English, it was Dutch, Low Dutch, to be precise, the language of her enslavers, the only word she heard for the first 9 years of her life. The Hardenberg estate was a Dutch-speaking world. Isabella grew up immersed in the customs, the Reformed church practices, the very rhythms of Dutch colonial culture transplanted to the Hudson Valley. She was one of 10 or 12 children born to James and Elizabeth. She watched as her siblings were sold away, one by one. The trauma of family separation marked her from childhood. Her mother would weep and say, in the Dutch that Isabella understood, my God, my children will be sold into slavery." It was both lament and prophecy. When Johannes Hardenberg died in 1799, Isabella was about 2 years old. She and her parents became the property of his son Charles. She remembered Charles Hardenberg. He was the first enslaver she would recall clearly. But in 1808, when Isabella was around 9, Charles Hardenberg died too. What happened next tells you everything about how slavery worked in the North. The estate was settled, assets were inventoried, and among those assets, listed in the Ulster County Surrogate's court documents, like livestock or furniture, was a girl named Isabella. She was sold at auction. John Neely bought her for $100. The sale included a flock of sheep. Isabella and the sheep purchased together. Neely lived near Kingston, and his family spoke only English. For Isabella, who knew only Dutch, this created a nightmare. She couldn't understand their commands. When she failed to follow orders she didn't comprehend, Neely beat her. She would later describe how he once whipped her with a bundle of rods that had been heated in the fire embers and bound together with cords. The scars stayed with her for life. Physical scars, yes, but also the psychological weight of being punished for something beyond her control. After about a year of this, a fisherman named Martinus Shriver appeared. He'd come at the suggestion of Isabella's father, who somehow got word to him about his daughter's suffering. Shriver bought Isabella for $105. He owned a tavern and a farm in Port Ewan, about 5 or 6 miles from the Neelys. Isabella later said she walked beside Shriver's horse, believing he'd been sent as an answer to her prayers. She spent 18 months with him. Then, in 1810, she was sold again, this time to John Dumont of West Park, for $175. John Dumont would be Isabella's last enslaver, and her time there stretched across 16 years. This is where her adult life took shape, and it wasn't simple. John Dumont's wife, Elizabeth, made Isabella's life difficult with constant harassment and tension. John Dumont himself raped her, an assault that produced no legal consequences because enslaved women had no protection under law. Around 1815, Isabella fell in love with a man named Robert, who was enslaved on a neighboring farm owned by a man named Catlin. But Catlin forbade the relationship. He wanted Robert to marry someone on his own property, to keep any children as his property. When Robert defied these orders and visited Isabella, Catlin found him. He beat Robert severely. John Dumont intervened, stopping the beating and following them back to ensure Robert's safety, but the damage was done. Isabella and Robert never saw each other again. Instead, Isabella was forced to marry another enslaved man named Thomas, also owned by Dumont. Between 1815 and the mid-1820s, she had 5 children: Diana, Peter, Elizabeth, Sophia, and possibly one other. This was her life, labor in Dumont's household, bearing and raising children who were not truly hers because they belonged to someone else. Watching time pass while freedom remained a distant abstraction. But freedom was actually coming. In 1799, New York had passed a law for gradual abolition. Anyone born to enslaved women after July 4, 1799, would eventually be freed, though they'd have to serve their mother's owner until they were 25 or 28 years old. Anyone born before that date was redefined as an indentured servant but remained enslaved for life. Then, in 1817, the state legislature went further. They declared that everyone still enslaved in New York would be freed on July 4, 1827. Isabella was born in 1797, which meant she'd been enslaved her entire life under the old system. But now she had a date, a specific moment when the law would set her free. John Dumont promised to free her a year early in 1826 as a reward for her faithful service. But when the time came, he changed his mind. He claimed she hadn't worked hard enough because a hand injury had slowed her down. She'd more than made up for lost time, she knew. But Dumont's promise meant nothing without his willingness to honor it. So Isabella made a decision. Before 1826 ended, she would leave. She later explained her reasoning with that characteristic directness. She didn't run away, she said. Running away was wrong. Instead, she walked away by daylight, taking her infant daughter Sophia. She couldn't bring the others. They stayed behind. She walked to New Paltz, to the home of Isaac and Maria Van Wagenen, Quakers who opposed slavery. When John Dumont tracked her down and demanded she return, Isaac Van Wagenen offered to buy out Isabella's service for the remainder of the year. $20 for Isabella, $5 for the child. Dumont accepted, but Van Wagenen told Isabella something crucial. "Don't call me master," he said. "There's only one master, and he's master to both of us." "What should I call you then?" Isabella asked. "Call me Isaac Van Wagenen," he replied, "and my wife is Maria Van Wagenen." That small exchange mattered. It was a recognition of her humanity, a refusal to accept the master-slave relationship even as a legal technicality. Isabella took their surname. She became Isabella Van Wagenen, and when July 4, 1827 arrived, she was legally free under New York law. But freedom came with immediate crisis. She discovered that John Dumont's relatives, the Gedneys, had illegally sold her 5-year-old son Peter to their brother-in-law, a planter in Alabama. Under New York law, enslaved people couldn't be sold out of state. The sale was illegal. But illegal didn't mean Peter was coming back without a fight. Isabella did something remarkable. With help from local Quakers and the Van Wagenens, she went to the Ulster County Courthouse in Kingston. She filed a lawsuit against Solomon Gedney for the return of her son. This was 1828. A black woman, barely a year into her freedom, was suing a white man in court. The case took months, but Isabella won. Peter was returned to her. She became the first black woman in United States history to successfully sue a white man and win. Think about what that required. Not just courage, but an absolute belief that the law, despite everything it had done to her, could be made to serve justice. In 1828, Isabella moved to New York City with Peter. She worked as a housekeeper for Elijah Pearson, an evangelical preacher. The city was alive with religious revival, part of what historians call the Second Great Awakening. Isabella threw herself into it. She attended meetings, prayer gatherings, revival services. Her faith, which had sustained her through slavery, now became the organizing principle of her free life. She became known as a powerful speaker, someone who could testify to her experiences and move people with her conviction. For a time in the 1830s, she got involved with a religious commune led by a charismatic preacher who turned out to be corrupt. When the group fell apart amid scandal, Isabella was briefly caught up in the fallout, but she emerged with her faith intact and her determination strengthened. By the early 1840s, she was doing missionary work among New York's poor, teaching and preaching, building a reputation as someone who spoke truth plainly. Then came 1843, June 1st, Pentecost Sunday. Isabella had what she believed was a divine calling. The Spirit, she said, called on her to leave the city and travel through the countryside, testifying to the hope that was in her. She needed a new name for this new mission. She chose 2 words that captured what she intended to do. Sojourner, because she would travel, moving from place to place. Truth, because she would speak it. Sojourner Truth. She was 46 years old. She took a few possessions in a pillowcase and walked north, working her way through the Connecticut River Valley toward Massachusetts. She had no formal plan, no organization backing her. She spoke at camp meetings, in churches, wherever people would listen. The Millerites, followers of William Miller, who believed Christ would return in 1843 or 1844, welcomed her enthusiastically. She preached and sang, and people responded to her presence. She was nearly 6 feet tall, with a commanding voice and an intensity that held audiences. When the Millerite prediction failed and Christ didn't return, many followers were devastated. Truth distanced herself for a time, but she kept speaking. In 1844, she joined the Northampton Association of Education and Industry in Massachusetts, a utopian community founded by abolitionists. This was a turning point. The community included about 240 members over its existence, living on 470 acres. They ran a sawmill, a grist mill, a silk factory. They supported abolition, women's rights, religious tolerance, pacifism. The community was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And it was there that Sojourner Truth met William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, 2 of the most prominent abolitionists in America. Garrison ran the American Anti-Slavery Society. he encouraged Truth to speak about her experiences in slavery. In 1845, she gave her first anti-slavery speech at the community's invitation. She discovered she had a gift for this, not despite her lack of formal education, but because of the raw power of her testimony. She'd lived what others merely opposed. When she spoke about being sold with a flock of sheep, about being beaten for not understanding English, about watching her children grow up as someone else's property, she gave slavery a human face, a voice. Her voice. The Northampton Association disbanded in 1846, unable to sustain itself financially, but Truth stayed in the area. She began dictating her life story to Olive Gilbert, a white abolitionist who helped her put it into writing. In 1850, William Lloyd Garrison privately published the book as The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, a Northern Slave. Truth supported herself by selling copies. The book brought her national recognition and provided her with a platform. She was now known beyond the circles of reformers and abolitionists. She was becoming a public figure. She attended her first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts, in 1850. The women's rights movement was still in its infancy. The Seneca Falls Convention had been held just 2 years earlier, in 1848. But already the movement was grappling with questions about who belonged, whose rights mattered, and how to think about the intersection of race and gender. Truth brought a perspective that many white feminists hadn't fully considered. She embodied a fact that needed repeating. Among the enslaved were women. Among women there were black people. In May 1851, Truth attended the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron. What happened there would become one of the most famous moments in American history, though the details are disputed. Truth gave a speech responding to men who argued that women were too weak, too delicate, too intellectually inferior to deserve equal rights. Her speech was extemporaneous. She didn't read from a prepared text. She spoke from the heart, from experience. The earliest account of her speech, published within a month in the Anti-Slavery Bugle, gives us the most reliable version of what she actually said. She talked about her physical strength, about plowing and planting and gathering into barns, about bearing the lash. She challenged the idea that women needed help getting into carriages or crossing muddy streets. She'd never received such help. She pointed out that if the first woman God made was strong enough to turn the world upside down alone, then women together ought to be able to turn it right side up again. But the version most people know came from Frances Dana Barker Gage, who published her account 12 years later in 1863. Gage's version included the famous refrain, "Ain't I a woman?" It also rendered Truth's speech in a Southern slave dialect that Truth never spoke. Remember, Truth grew up speaking Dutch and spoke English with a Dutch accent her entire life. She never had a Southern accent. Gage embellished and altered the speech, imposing stereotypes that didn't match Truth's actual speaking style. Yet Gage's version, republished in 1875, 1881, and 1889, became the one that entered American memory. The power of the speech remains, even if the exact words were mediated through someone else's imagination. Throughout the 1850s, Truth traveled constantly, speaking at abolitionist gatherings, women's rights conventions, religious meetings. She spoke in Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Kansas. She sold copies of her narrative and photographs of herself with the caption, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." The photographs became calling cards, a way to fund her work and maintain her independence. She never learned to read or write, but she understood the power of her image and her story. She faced hostility, hecklers at her speeches, people who questioned whether she was really a woman. In Indiana, skeptics demanded she prove her gender by showing her breasts. She did, shaming the crowd in the process. She encountered Frederick Douglass repeatedly at various gatherings. In 1852, when Douglass spoke passionately about the possible necessity of violence in the fight against slavery, Truth interrupted him. "Frederick," she called out, "is God gone?" It was her way of insisting that moral persuasion, not violence, should guide the struggle. They disagreed on tactics, but both remained committed to the larger cause. By 1857, Truth had moved to Michigan, settling first in Harmonia and later in Battle Creek, where her daughters Elizabeth, Diana, and Sophia lived. Michigan became her home base, though she continued to travel and speak. When the Civil War began in 1861, Truth threw herself into supporting the Union cause. She helped recruit black men for the Union Army. Her grandson, James Caldwell, enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, one of the first African American units. She sang and spoke at recruitment meetings, raising money and supplies for black troops. She composed a song called "The Valiant Soldiers," set to the tune of "John Brown's Body," and performed it to raise spirits and funds. In 1864, Truth made her way to Washington, D.C. She'd been speaking on behalf of Abraham Lincoln's re-election campaign, and she wanted to meet him. She worked for the National Freedmen's Relief Association, helping newly freed people transition to freedom. But getting an audience with the president required connections she didn't have on her own. She reached out to Lucy Coleman, a white abolitionist working with the National Association for the Relief of Destitute Colored Women and Children. Coleman connected her with Elizabeth Keckley, Mary Lincoln's confidant and dressmaker, herself a formerly enslaved woman who'd bought her freedom. An appointment was arranged for October 29, 1864, less than a week before the election. Truth arrived at the White House around 8 in the morning with Lucy Coleman. About a dozen people were waiting in the reception room, including 2 black women. Truth watched as Lincoln spoke with each person, showing, she noted, as much kindness to the black visitors as to the white ones, if not more. When it was her turn, Coleman introduced her. "This is Sojourner Truth, who has wanted to meet you." Accounts of what happened next vary. Lucy Coleman later remembered Lincoln as somewhat awkward, calling Truth auntie as he might address a washerwoman, and claiming he said he wasn't an abolitionist, that circumstances had compelled him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. But Truth's own account, dictated a month after the meeting, paints a different picture. She said Lincoln treated her with more kindness and cordiality than anyone ever had. She told him she'd never heard of him before he became president. He smiled and replied that he'd heard of her many times before that. He showed her a Bible that had been presented to him by the black community of Baltimore. She remarked on the irony that the head of government now received this Bible from people whose ancestors had been forbidden to read it under laws that same government once sanctioned. Truth asked Lincoln to sign her autograph book, which contained signatures of many prominent people. With the same hand that had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln wrote, "For Anti-Sojourner Truth, October 29, 1864, A. Lincoln." As she was leaving, Lincoln stood and took her hand. "I would be pleased to have you call again," he said. Truth felt she'd been in the presence of a friend. The meeting has been debated by historians ever since. Did Lincoln say he was compelled, or that circumstances gave him the opportunity to emancipate the enslaved? We'll never know with certainty. Lucy Coleman was a militant abolitionist who had little patience for Lincoln's cautious approach to slavery. Her memory might have been colored by her own frustrations. What we know for certain is that Lincoln signed Truth's book, that the meeting happened, and that Truth spoke of it with warmth for the rest of her life. After meeting Lincoln, Truth continued her work in Washington. In 1865, she accepted a position with the National Freedmen's Relief Association at Freedmen's Village in Arlington Heights, the settlement established for formerly enslaved people on land that had belonged to Robert E. Lee. She served as counselor to the freed people, working with the Freedmen's Bureau to help find jobs, collect provisions for the Freedmen's Hospital, and provide support for people navigating their new lives. But Truth didn't just help behind the scenes. She confronted segregation directly. Washington's streetcars were segregated by custom, if not always by law. Black passengers were forced to ride on the outside platforms or in separate cars, even in harsh weather. Truth refused to accept this. She began deliberately riding the streetcars to force the issue. On multiple occasions, conductors tried to block her, sometimes violently. She ensured one conductor's arrest and won her subsequent case. Her actions helped push Washington toward desegregating its public transportation, anticipating Rosa Parks by almost a century. In the late 1860s, Truth took up a new cause. She believed that formerly enslaved people deserved land, economics, or independence, not just legal freedom. She collected thousands of signatures on petitions requesting that the federal government provide land grants to freed people. She lobbied Congress. She gave speeches arguing that black people should be given land in the West to build homes and prosper. It was a version of the broken promise of 40 acres and a mule, the reparations that never came. Despite her efforts, Congress never acted on her petition. The land was never provided. She met with President Ulysses S. Grant in the White House, continuing her advocacy work. In 1872, she returned to Battle Creek and tried to vote in the presidential election. She was turned away at the polling place. Women wouldn't get the vote for nearly another 50 years. And even then, black women in many states would face continued disenfranchisement. Truth kept speaking about abolition, women's rights, prison reform, temperance. She advocated against capital punishment. She challenged the women's suffrage movement when it tried to prioritize white women's rights over black men's voting rights. In 1867, at an Equal Rights Association meeting, she reminded the audience that she came from the country of the slave, and that they had to keep pushing while things were stirring. "Women have no right, no voice," she said. "Nobody speaks for them." The suffrage movement split over the question of the 15th Amendment, which would grant voting rights to black men but not to women. Some white suffragists opposed it, arguing that if they couldn't have the vote, neither should black men. Truth tried to hold the movement together, insisting that black women's freedom required both racial and gender equality. She was correct in her assessment that failing to enfranchise black women would delay freedom for all women, though her warnings went largely unheeded. As she aged, Truth's health declined. She became nearly blind and deaf, but she continued to travel and speak as long as her body allowed. She returned to Battle Creek, to the home she'd purchased there, surrounded by her daughters and their families. She died on November 26, 1883, at the age of 86. Her funeral was one of the largest Battle Creek had ever seen. Thousands of people came to pay their respects. The New York Globe published an obituary that read, in part, "Sojourner Truth stands preeminently as the only colored woman who gained a national reputation on the lecture platform in the days before the Civil War." She was buried at Oak Hill Cemetery in Battle Creek. What do we make of Sojourner Truth's life now, more than a century and a half after her death. Her legacy is everywhere and nowhere. Everywhere in the sense that she's become an icon, a symbol invoked by movements for justice. A bust of her was unveiled in the U.S. Capitol in 2009, making her the first African-American woman memorialized there. In 1997, NASA named the Mars Pathfinder robot Sojourner in her honor. There are statues, historical markers, schools, scholarships bearing her name. She appears in history textbooks, usually for that one speech, the one that Francis Gage rewrote. But her legacy is also nowhere in the sense that we've simplified her, made her easier to digest. We remember Ain't I a Woman in a version she probably never spoke. We celebrate her as an abolitionist and feminist icon without always reckoning with the complexity of her positions. She believed in Christianity fervently, spoke in religious terms that can make modern secular activists uncomfortable. She was sometimes conservative in her views about how freed people should conduct themselves, stressing industry and self-reliance in ways that could be read as victim-blaming. She operated in a world of white abolitionists who often condescended to her, edited her words, shaped her narrative for their own purposes. But what remains, what can't be simplified away, is the fact of her transformation and her persistence. Isabella Baumfree became Sojourner Truth through an act of faith and will. She walked away from slavery and then spent the next 50-plus years walking toward justice. Not running toward it in some grand revolutionary gesture, but walking, one step after another, speech after speech, confrontation after confrontation, year after year. She understood something that we still struggle to grasp. Freedom isn't a single moment of liberation. It's a practice. It's something you have to claim daily, defend constantly, extend to others perpetually. When she won her lawsuit to get Peter back, she didn't stop there. When she gained her freedom, she didn't retreat into private life. When she found her voice as a preacher, she didn't limit herself to religion. She kept pushing, kept expanding the definition of who deserved rights and dignity. She also understood the intersection of oppressions before that language existed. She embodied a fact that needed repeating then and needs repeating now. Among the enslaved were women. Among women, there are black people. You can't fight for racial justice while ignoring gender. You can't fight for women's rights while ignoring race. The struggles are bound together because people live at the intersections. Truth's relationship with the white-dominated women's movement was complicated. She challenged white feminists to recognize that their experience wasn't universal. When they talked about women being too delicate to vote or to work outside the home, she pointed to her own life. Nobody had ever helped her into a carriage. She'd plowed and planted. She'd borne the lash. She was a woman too, wasn't she? But the movement often used her testimony to advance a limited agenda. They celebrated her when it suited them, and sidelined her when it didn't. Similarly, her relationship with male abolitionists had its tensions. Frederick Douglass respected her, but they disagreed on tactics and priorities. When Douglass seemed to advocate violence, she challenged him. When male abolitionists focused solely on slavery without addressing women's rights, she pushed back. She refused to be anyone's token, anyone's proof of progress. She insisted on being heard on her own terms. There's something instructive in how her most famous speech has been altered and mythologized. The fact that we know the Gage version better than the original tells us something about how history gets written, who gets to write it, and whose voices get preserved or distorted. Truth never wrote her own story down because she couldn't. Every account we have of her words was mediated through someone else. Olive Gilbert wrote her narrative. Various abolitionists recorded her speeches. Francis Gage rewrote them. Even Truth's own letters were dictated to others. This raises questions about authenticity and agency. How much of what we think we know about Sojourner Truth is actually her? And how much is what white editors and transcribers thought she should sound like? The imposition of a Southern slave dialect onto her speech, when she actually spoke English with a Dutch accent, reveals the assumptions and stereotypes at work. It's easier for some audiences to imagine a formerly enslaved person speaking in broken English than to recognize the multilingual reality of Northern slavery. Yet Truth used these white mediators strategically. She understood that in 19th century America, a black woman who couldn't read or write needed allies to amplify her voice. She sold her narrative, her photographs, her story as a means of survival and influence. She knew how to work within the constraints she faced while still pushing against them. Her work with the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War shows her practical approach to freedom. She didn't just make speeches. She helped people find jobs, navigate bureaucracy, build lives. She challenged segregation not just in principle but in practice, riding those streetcars until the system changed. When she advocated for land grants, she was pushing for economic justice, understanding that political freedom without economic security was incomplete. The fact that Congress never acted on her petition for land grants is telling. Reconstruction failed in part because it promised freedom without providing the material basis for it. Sojourner Truth saw this clearly. She knew that telling people they were free while leaving them landless and penniless was a hollow gesture. But power concedes nothing without a demand, as Frederick Douglass said, and sometimes it concedes nothing even with a demand. Truth's attempt to vote in 1872 connects her story to the long struggle for women's suffrage. She didn't live to see the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920. She didn't see the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which finally provided federal enforcement of voting rights for Black Americans after a century of disenfranchisement. But her attempt to vote was part of the continuum of resistance, the insistence that if the nation claimed to be a democracy, it had to include everyone. Her later years show someone who never stopped fighting even as her body failed. Nearly blind, nearly deaf, she still spoke out. She still traveled. She still insisted that the work wasn't finished. There's something both inspiring and heartbreaking about that. Inspiring because it shows the depth of her commitment. Heartbreaking because it reveals how far we still had to go, how far we still have to go. Sojourner Truth's story matters today because the questions she raised remain unresolved. Who gets to be free? What does freedom mean? Is legal freedom enough without economic security, political power, social respect? How do we build movements that recognize the different experiences of people at various intersections of oppression? How do we prevent movements from replicating the hierarchies they claim to challenge? Her life also reminds us that history is made by people who insist on being heard even when the world tells them to be quiet. She was an illiterate woman in a society that valued education. A black woman in a society that devalued both blackness and womanhood. A formerly enslaved person in a society built on slavery. She had every reason to disappear into private life, to protect herself from exposure, to accept the limitations others tried to impose. Instead, she walked north with a pillowcase of belongings and spent half a century speaking truth to power. That's not a simple inspirational story. It's a complicated, difficult, often painful story about what it costs to fight for justice. Truth experienced trauma, loss, violence, betrayal. She lost children. She bore scars, physical and emotional, that never fully healed. She watched the promises of Reconstruction collapse. She saw movements she'd helped build exclude or marginalize people like her. She knew the bitter truth that progress is never guaranteed, that rights won can be lost, that justice delayed might be justice denied. But she also experienced moments of triumph. She got Peter back. She bought her own house. She met presidents. She commanded audiences of thousands. She influenced the course of both the abolitionist and women's rights movements. She lived to see slavery end, even if she didn't live to see true equality. The challenge for us is to remember her fully, not as a sanitized icon, not as a simple symbol, but as a complex human being who made choices, faced constraints, achieved some victories, suffered many defeats, and never stopped trying. Her story doesn't give us easy answers. It gives us questions worth asking. It gives us a model of persistence worth studying. It gives us a voice worth listening to, even now, especially now. Sojourner Truth walked to freedom. Then she kept walking. She walked through New England giving speeches. She walked through Washington challenging segregation. She walked through history leaving footprints we're still following. Not because she was superhuman, but because she was determined. Because she believed that if the first woman God made could turn the world upside down alone, then all of us together ought to be able to turn it right side up again. That's the truth she sojourned to share. That freedom is possible. That justice is worth fighting for. That voices raised together can move mountains, or at least move them a little, push them enough that the next generation can push further. She didn't finish the work. No one person could. But she did her part, walked her miles, spoke her truth, and in doing so, she showed us that the path to freedom isn't run in a day. It's walked in a lifetime, step by step, word by word. From Isabella Baumfree to Isabella van Wagenen to Sojourner Truth. From slavery to freedom to something beyond freedom. To legacy, to memory. To the long, unfinished work of making this country live up to its own promises.